Everyone. We're continuing on in our studies from the book of James, chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. Hopefully, everyone has already read the whole book. It's only a few chapters. So then, hopefully, recently you would have reread James chapter 3. And so we're not reading it today. We're just going to go straight into it. The topic seems to suddenly shift from the last chapter. And again, we had said this in the very beginning, this is somewhat the style of James. There's a person by the name of Martin Luther, not the same as Martin Luther King, but a theologian by the name of Martin Luther. When he reads the book of James, he would call it as an epistle of straw. And he really didn't like this book. And he said, especially looking at these first few verses of chapter 3, where it says, few should think themselves to be teachers. Luther wrote in his notes, I wish James took his own advice and didn't write this book, because he didn't like how he was teaching about faith and works going hand in hand. Now, we're not going to go to that extent. He had a particular theology in mind, and anything that didn't back up that particular view of his theology, he wrestled with. But here, James starts off by saying in this first part of chapter 3, not many of you should become teachers. And then he says, my brothers, and some translations say, my brothers and sisters, for we who teach will be judged with greater strictness. Why is it that few people should be considering themselves as teachers? Because it's a very privileged task, but not in that there's some power or prestige associated with it. A teacher is someone who's supposed to bring knowledge and information and help the students to gain wisdom. It's a very influential position. The teacher has the capacity to bring the people in a right path, or the teacher, and we've seen this in many places before, a teacher who has wrong intentions in mind can use their words and lead whole groups of people astray, away from the traditional teachings of the scripture. And so a person who is a teacher, they need to be held to a high standard. But then does that mean that everything else that he's going to talk about is only for the position of a teacher? Because he goes on to say some very good things about how we should keep our tongue in check and how we should watch our words. Now, when we read this passage, please don't think that what James is saying is that for the bishops and the achins and the Sunday school teachers, you are in that special position. You be careful with your words. Everyone else, don't worry about it. That's not what he's saying. Remember, he opens the book by writing to all the 12 tribes in the diaspora. And so he's talking to everybody, talking to common people. And I think what is being subtly hinted at here is this idea that in a way, maybe we should see how are we to be as teachers. As parents, are we not teachers? Don't we teach our kids right from wrong? What about mentors that we have in our lives? There's so many people that we learn from. You know, when the Sunday school children sing or do a skit, we're learning something from them even. And so the idea isn't that there are few people who have the gift of teaching. The idea is very few people use this gift. Very few people are able to control their tongue so that they can be good teachers. I think this is the direction in which he's leading us. And so if you want to be a good teacher, if you want to be a person who ought to be held to a higher standard, because we all should be, well, then we have to make sure we keep track of our tongue. And so this is how he goes from the topic of faith without works is dead, and now to the next major topic, which is watching our speech. Both of them are in the same category as being genuine Christians. Remember last time we talked about a few different ways in which Christians ought to be genuine. A genuine Christian is someone who does not show partiality, is not just a listener, but a doer of the word. A genuine Christian is one who cares for the widows and for the poor. A genuine Christian is one who does not yield into temptation. A genuine Christian is one who has works that substantiates their faith. And here, a genuine Christian is someone who has to keep track of their tongue and to put it in control, in check. And so we see the analogies then that he uses in this first part. He says that the tongue is needs to be perfect, but no one can be perfect. And so in the end of verse 3, he calls it as a bridle. In the following verse, he says that it's like a bit put in the horse's mouth. In the verse after that, it's like the rudder that guides the ship. So a large animal like a horse, it's any day stronger than we are. Even a young horse probably has more strength than a good-sized adult. But how is it that even you can see women riders, you can see young children who ride, how are they able to control such a large animal? Well, it's just because of one small thing that goes through the mouth of the horse, and by pulling on it one way or the other, you are able to direct the direction of this big beast. The same thing happens with the ship. I don't know if anyone's seen this, maybe you have. And these very, very large ships will have a very small piece of equipment in the back that's called a rudder. And based on which direction that flap is turned, the whole ship will go in that direction. The point is this: it doesn't take a whole lot to control something very big. What needs to happen is we have to be able to control the right thing. And the right thing here that James is trying to point out is our speech, our mouth. If we're able to control this mouth of ours, then we can direct the whole body in the right way that it ought to go. We know, and we all at times lose track of that ability, and we'll say something that can never be taken back. And once you say something like that, it creates many ripples later on down the line. And this is why it's very important that people be careful when as all of us are teaching or as we're just living our lives. I've seen it happen that if a tongue is controlled, it's able to not only control that person, but you can actually have a great impact on the people around. You all know which church I grew up in. So when I say stories from home, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But for those who are watching this, I'm not going to say the name of the parish. In our home church, there were definitely times when words were not controlled. But every now and then, there would be an individual who would stand up and say something very calmly. And when this person spoke, it is very difficult for other people to then follow up. There's something about his words and the way in which he spoke them that was able to calm the situation down. Now, this is the power that speech has. We might think to ourselves, our actions are more important than our words. And we know that there are phrases like that, right? An action speaks louder than words. But here, James is telling us something very clear. And that's if we don't take control of this tongue, then it will become a big liability for us. And he talks about some of those liabilities. It says in verses 5 and 6. So in the previous section, he talks about controlling the tongue. In these verses 5 and 6, he talks about how the tongue is a consuming fire. It once it gets out, it just starts to burn everything around it. And it's very, like we said already, it's very difficult to get it back. Sometimes we've had a conversation, and when the words are not used in a calm, gentle manner, the message itself gets lost. And it's difficult to understand what are they actually saying, because the words are themselves are so crass that we don't want to hear the rest of what it is. There are times when I'll hear something and it'll take me a day or two to just process what was said, to understand what the real idea was that the person was trying to convey. It's so difficult because the words that we use when we spew them out, they end up catching fire to everything else. And if I just listen to some of the crass things, I'll get sidetracked into this thing or that thing, or I'll have anger towards the person who said the thing to me. But all the while, there's a need being presented, right? There's an actual, genuine, emotional content. There's something that a person is trying to convey to me. But that's so difficult to convey it when our words are not used and properly to shape the message that we want to give. Same thing when we talk to our children. We might be upset with them for something. And instead of just very clearly saying, this is why I'm upset with you, we'll sometimes lose track of that tongue and we'll say something, the volume will go up, we'll add some extra words, and then nothing has gotten any better. Instead, it's made them go and slam the door. And now you're upset, they're upset, and now no one wants to talk to each other. And it's this fire that just keeps going and going. When this sort of thing happens, just like in a real life situation, when a forest fire happens, it's not only that it spreads, it takes a long time to restore back to the way that it was. We used to live in Los Angeles, and there very often we would have wildfires. One year, the wildfire came very close to the main LA Achins parsonage. So when we went for a visit, the ash is coming like snow onto the property. And we could see from Achin's house the hill that was completely getting burned up. Years later, even though it's green, you can tell something is wrong, because over here there are these trees, but in that area there are no trees yet. It takes years for these things to come back, all because of that one spark. The words that we say are very powerful, very influential, and so we have to be very careful about what we say. Here, James refers it to like a wild animal. He says humans have been able to control and tame all of the other creatures. That's not exactly true, but he's making a point here. And so he can use this kind of over-the-top language. He says we can control all the other wild animals, but this one thing becomes so difficult for us to control. And so now we're getting to the point where he's showing us that there is this problem, but he's not exactly told us what the source of the problem is yet. He's just saying that we have this problem with what we're saying, what comes out of our mouths. When he gets into verses 9 and 10, he makes the problem a little bit more clear and a little bit more severe. In verses 9 and 10, he says this: with it, that is with our tongue, we bless the Lord and Father, and with it we curse those who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this ought not to be so. And then he goes on to talk about how the water, but we'll get to that in a second. This contradiction, right, of being able to say one thing one time and then the opposite thing in the other time, that tells us something about who we really are. Now, when you are working and if you accidentally hit your finger, there's this word that might come out. That word that comes out instantaneously, whatever that word may be, is a reflection of what is underneath the filter that we have. Everybody has a filter. That's that thing that helps us to say the right things in front of the right people. Some people will turn the filter on the full strength if the tirumeni comes. Some people will lower the filter when the action is there. Some people have no filter in their home, right? They completely turn it off. And the amount that we filter it doesn't convey who we really are. What conveys who we really are is when there's no filter in place. And that's why he's saying here, when people are praising God and cursing people at the same time, the thing that is probably false might be the praising God part. Because a person who genuinely praises God won't be able to curse someone who is created in the image of God. But a person who genuinely doesn't care about another being, yes, they can fake and they can pretend to praise God. We have to be very careful about then what is the real us. There's a story of a Christian businessman who was working with his partner, and one day got very angry and shouted at him and said all sorts of things. And later on, he came back and apologized and said, I'm very sorry. That's not the real me. I was having a bad day. And he told the person, that might not be all of you, but that certainly was inside of you. Whatever that was, that's not something foreign. There's a part of you that is that way. And that's what our words reflect. And this is why James is now going to get to verse 11 and 12. He wants us to understand why the tongue is so important. The tongue is so important because the tongue is the gateway to the heart. The tongue reveals what is inside of us. Right? He goes on to say in verse 11, does a spring pour forth from the same opening both fresh and brackish water? Can a fig tree, my brother and sister, yield olives, or a grapevine figs? No more can salt water yield fresh. The idea then here is how James is saying, what is on the inside, what is in our heart, is what shows up on our tongue. So when we talk about putting the bridle and putting the rudder, we're not talking about external filters. What James really wants us to wrestle with is the source of these words. Now look back into the Gospels. Read Matthew chapter 12, verse 34 to 37. Can one of you read that? Matthew chapter 12, 34 to 37.
നിങ്ങൾ ദുഷ്ടരായിരിക്കുന്നത് നല്ലത് സംസാരിപ്പാൻ എങ്ങനെ കഴിയും? ഹൃദയം നിറഞ്ഞ കവിയുന്നതിൽ നിന്നല്ലോ വായ് സംസാരിക്കുന്നത്. നല്ല മനുഷ്യൻ തൻ്റെ നല്ല നിക്ഷേപത്തിൽ നിന്ന് നല്ലത് പുറപ്പെടുവിക്കുന്നു. ദുഷ്ട മനുഷ്യൻ ദുർനിക്ഷേപത്തിൽ നിന്ന് തീയത് പുറപ്പെടുവിക്കുന്നു. എന്നാൽ മനുഷ്യർ പറയുന്ന ഏത് നിസ്സാര വാക്കിനും ന്യായവിധി ദിവസത്തിൽ കണക്ക് ബോധിപ്പിക്കേണ്ടി വരും എന്ന് ഞാൻ നിങ്ങളോട് പറയുന്നു. നിന്റെ വാക്കുകളാൽ നീതീകരിക്കപ്പെടുകയും നിന്റെ വാക്കുകളാൽ കുറ്റം വിധിക്കപ്പെടുകയും ചെയ്യും.
Thank you. I don't know how you feel when you hear that being read. That makes me very nervous. And to know that every word will be tracked and we'll have to give an account for these words that we use. Even when we have some good intention in mind for how our children should be or how someone should act, when we can't control our words and say things that are crass or unbecoming of a Christian, it's being recorded. Now, there's a big difference between when something is recorded versus when you do a program live. When you do a program live and you make a mistake, you can go back and fix it. If you're ever recording something, you want it to be perfect. Why? Because you know that they all can always go back and rewind and check every single thing. There's a record of it. And there's a record of our speech. God is keeping track of these things. And this is why we should never take it lightly. We can't say, oh, this is just how I am. That's no excuse. There's no provision in this book of James that gives us the option of saying, you don't have to worry about your words. James is very clear. Everything needs to be kept in control. Now, when we say this, we're not saying that you cannot use strong language. That's not exactly what we're saying either. But we're saying that everything needs to have a godly intention behind it. Right? So when Jesus looked at the Pharisees and he says, "You brood of vipers," perhaps in those days that might be a big, terrible insult. But Jesus was saying it for a particular reason. Right? We have to be careful to give ourselves the same freedom of speech that Jesus had, because Jesus's intentions were always pure, and we have to then be very careful about our intentions. But the idea is still the same, that everything that we say is being monitored, and everything that we say is a reflection of our heart. Matthew chapter 15, verse 10 to 11, again, is the same thing. There, the passage just prior, the disciples and Jesus were eating without washing their hands. And in today's standards, that's a terrible thing to do. In those days, it was even worse, because there not only is there a biological reason for washing the hands, there's a theological reason for washing the hands, according to the Pharisees. And Jesus and his disciples didn't wash their hands. And Jesus says, listen, you care so much about these traditions, but there's something more important than these traditions. And then he goes on to say, what makes a person dirty is not what goes in. What defiles a person is what comes out. And very specifically, what comes out of our mouth. The way we talk, the kindness that we say with our words, that reflects who we are, right? Rather than the traditions that we uphold. And so this is very important for us to understand. If we want to have a genuineness as a Christian, it's not just that we try to make sure that every word is a decent word. We have to go to the source. We have to make sure our heart is with God. If our heart is with God, then the words that we say will be in keeping. Then a fig tree will produce fig. Then an olive tree will produce olive, because there's a genuineness there. In Proverbs chapter 13, verse 14, can one person read that? Proverbs chapter 13, verse 14.
ജ്ഞാനിയുടെ ഉപദേശം ജീവന്റെ ഉറവാകുന്നു, അതിനാൽ മരണത്തിന്റെ കടികളെ ഒഴിഞ്ഞു പോകുന്നു. 13:14 അല്ലേ?
That's Proverbs chapter 13, verse 14.
ജ്ഞാനിയുടെ ഉപദേശം ജീവന്റെ ഉറവാകുന്നു, അതിനാൽ മരണത്തിന്റെ കെണികളെ ഒഴിഞ്ഞു പോകുന്നു.
Yeah, the teachings of the wise is a fountain of life, so that one may avoid the snares of death. The teachings of the wise, that is the things that are coming out of the righteous person's mouth, is going to be a fountain of life. Remember, James is talking about the source of the water. The source of the water determines the nature of the water that we get from it. And the person who is living righteously is a person who becomes a good source of water. And one last thing that we can say, because this is, so far what James has done is he's pointed out one more characteristic of a genuine Christian, and that is they have control over the tongue. But he says this only because this points to our heart. But he didn't exactly say, he assumes that we know this next part. We need to pray earnestly that God would transform our hearts so that our source will be a source of life as well. That when we speak, that we're speaking words of encouragement, words of forgiveness, words of love. In Psalm chapter 141, Psalm 141, verses 3 and 4, it goes like this. And this is a Psalm of David. Set a guard over my mouth, O Lord. Keep watch over the door of my lips. Do not turn my heart to any evil, to busy myself with wicked deeds. In the company of those who work iniquity, do not let me eat of their delicacies. That verse 3 especially again, set a guard over my mouth, O Lord. Keep watch over the door of my lips. For us, this can be our prayer. As we read this passage of James, let us take some time to make sure that we are humble enough to ask that God keep watch over our heart, because the heart is from where we get all these words that we use. Some examples of good words that we can say. This may be new for some people, it may not be. Words like thank you, please, I'm sorry, right? I love you. These are words that show what is on the inside, and these are words that can, the opposite of spreading like fire, but it's still a positive sense. This can become a source of healing for the whole land around us. So let us take some time to meditate on this a bit more, because this is not an abstract teaching. This is not a theology class. James is talking to you, to me, on a very personal level. And he's just saying something very frank and very simple. Hey, we need to be sincere in our faith. Let's make sure that every word that comes out is in keeping with Christ and his lifestyle. So may the good Lord strengthen us, and we'll pause here. If there are any questions, we can take them.